My wife has a flower bed along the south side of our house that has had colour in it every single week from the middle of May until the first hard frost in October for the last 6 years. Not flowers that bloom for 2 weeks and then sit there green for the rest of the season, the way most perennials do. Actual colour, every week, the entire growing season. People stop their cars on the road in front of our property in July and August to look at it. We have had neighbours knock on the door and ask what we planted, because most of what grows in most flower beds blooms hard for 2 or 3 weeks in spring or early summer, and then becomes a green backdrop for the rest of the year, while everyone waits for fall colour from something else entirely. The secret is not luck, and it is not constant replanting. We do not treat these as annuals that need replacing every spring. Every plant I'm going to show you today is a true perennial, meaning it comes back from the same root system year after year, and every one of them either blooms continuously for an extended period, or blooms in a way that overlaps with the others, so that as one plant's bloom cycle winds down, another is just beginning, creating the appearance of constant colour, from a bed that is actually made up of plants with staggered, overlapping bloom windows. I am Hope Yoda, and my wife has spent close to 15 years building and refining this particular flower bed, learning which plants genuinely bloom for months rather than weeks, which plants need almost no attention once established, and which plants people assume are difficult or rare when they are actually some of the easiest things you can grow. I am going to walk through 11 of them today, in roughly the order they come into bloom through the season, along with what each one actually needs. Because half the value of knowing what to plant is knowing how to keep it blooming once it is in the ground. Before I get into the list, I want to explain the principle behind what makes a flower bed look like it has continuous colour. Because once you understand this, you can apply it to any space, not just the specific plants I'm about to name. There are 2 ways a flower bed achieves continuous colour. The first is planting individual species that have a genuinely extended bloom period. Plants that flower for 2, 3, even 4 months at a stretch, rather than 2 or 3 weeks. The second is layering plants with different but overlapping bloom windows, so that the bed as a whole always has something flowering, even though any individual plant might only be in bloom for a portion of the season. A well-designed perennial bed uses both strategies together. A few true long bloomers form the backbone of colour that runs through most of the season, and shorter blooming plants are layered in to fill the gaps and add variety and height and texture throughout. The first plant, and the one that blooms longest of anything in our bed, is Coreopsis, specifically the variety called Moonbeam, or the newer variety called Zagreb. This is a low, mounding plant with fine, almost ferny foliage and small, bright yellow daisy-like flowers that begins blooming in late May, and if you deadhead it periodically by trimming off the spent flower heads, continues blooming in waves all the way through to the first frost in October. This is genuinely a 5-month bloom period from a single plant, longer than almost anything else you can grow as a true perennial in most climate zones. It tolerates poor soil, requires very little water once established, and spreads gradually to form a wider patch over a few years without becoming aggressive or invasive. Plant it in full sun. It struggles in shade or even partial shade. The second plant is Salvia, specifically the Salvia nemorosa varieties like Mainite or Caradonna, which produce tall spikes of deep purple-blue flowers starting in late May or early June. The key to extending the bloom on Salvia, which would naturally bloom hard for about 4 weeks and then stop, is cutting the entire plant back by about half immediately after the first bloom flush fades, around early July. This forces a second flush of growth and flowering that typically runs from late July through September. Most people do not know to do this and assume their salvia is finished for the year after the first bloom. Cutting it back is the entire secret to getting a second, nearly equal bloom cycle out of the same plant. The third plant is Echinacea, the purple coneflower, which is native to much of the central and eastern United States and which blooms from June through September with proper deadheading. Beyond its long bloom period, Echinacea has a second benefit that matters if you care about pollinators the way we do on this property. It is one of the most reliable nectar sources for butterflies and native bees through the heat of summer, when many other flowers have finished blooming, and the seed heads left standing through fall and into winter feed goldfinches and other seed-eating birds. We leave the last bloom flush of the season standing rather than deadheading it, specifically for this reason. Echinacea is extremely drought-tolerant once established, and actually performs worse, becoming floppy and less floriferous in soil that is too consistently moist or too rich. The fourth plant is Gaillardia, commonly called blanket flower, which produces a continuous succession of red and yellow daisy-like flowers from June straight through to frost in most climates, making it one of the longest and most reliable bloomers on this entire list. It is exceptionally drought-tolerant, actually preferring poor, well-drained soil over rich garden soil, and it is one of the few plants on this list that genuinely thrives on neglect. Overwatering and over-fertilizing Gaillardia tends to shorten its lifespan and reduce blooming rather than improving it. Plant it where the soil drains well and resist the temptation to baby it. The fifth plant is Rudbeckia, commonly called black-eyed Susan, specifically the variety Goldsturm, which blooms from July through September with masses of bright yellow flowers with dark brown centers. It is one of the most reliable, low-maintenance perennials that exists for this climate, tolerating both heat and a wide range of soil conditions, and it spreads over time to form substantial drifts that provide significant color impact from a relatively small initial planting investment. Like Echinacea, it provides excellent late-season food for birds if you leave the seed heads standing into winter rather than cutting them back in fall. The sixth plant is Veronica, specifically the spiked varieties like Voile Candles, which produce tall, dense spikes of blue-purple flowers from June through August. Like Salvia, Veronica benefits significantly from being cut back by about a third after the first bloom flush, which encourages a second round of flower spikes later in the season. It prefers well-drained soil and full sun, but tolerates a wider range of conditions than some of the other plants on this list, including some light afternoon shade in hot climates. The seventh plant is Agastache, commonly called hyssop, specifically the variety Blue Fortune, which produces tall spikes of lavender blue flowers from July through September, and which has a genuinely remarkable relationship with pollinators. It is, in my observation over years of watching this bed, the single most attractive plant to bees and butterflies of anything we grow. And on a warm afternoon in August, the Agastache patch in our bed is audibly humming with activity. It has aromatic foliage, similar to mint or anise, that deer and rabbits generally avoid, which makes it valuable in areas where browsing pressure from wildlife is a real concern for other plantings. The eighth plant is Phlox paniculata, garden phlox, specifically mildew-resistant varieties like David, which produces large clusters of fragrant flowers from July through September. The mildew resistance matters because older varieties of garden phlox are notorious for developing powdery mildew on their foliage in humid climates by midsummer, which looks unattractive even while the plant continues to bloom. The newer mildew-resistant varieties largely avoid this problem. Phlox prefers consistently moist, well-drained soil and benefits from good air circulation around the plant, which is why thinning out about a third of the stems in early spring, removing the weakest growth, improves both air circulation and the size of the remaining flower clusters. The ninth plant is Sedum, specifically the variety Autumn Joy, which is somewhat different from everything else on this list because its primary bloom period comes later, from August through October, providing colour exactly when many of the summer bloomers are beginning to fade. The flower heads start out a pale green in summer, gradually shift to pink, and then to a deep rust red colour as fall approaches, which means the plant provides visual interest even before it is technically in full bloom. It is extremely drought-tolerant, requires essentially no maintenance beyond an early spring cleanup of the previous year's dried stems, and the seed heads provide winter interest if left standing, catching frost and snow in a way that adds structure to the garden, even in the dormant season. The 10th plant is Aster, specifically the New England Aster varieties, which bloom from September into October, often continuing right up until the first hard frost ends the season. This is the plant that extends our colour season the furthest into fall, picking up exactly where the sedum and the late rudbeckia are beginning to fade. Asters benefit from being cut back by about half in early summer, around the same time you would cut back salvia, which keeps the plant more compact and produces more flowering stems rather than a few tall, floppy ones. Without this cutting back, aster tends to grow quite tall and can flop over under the weight of its own flowers by the time it blooms in fall. The 11th plant, and the one I want to spend a bit more time on because it is the one most people have never heard of, despite it being one of the longest and most reliable bloomers we grow, is Gora. Sometimes called whirling butterflies or wandflower. It produces delicate, airy stems with small white or pink flowers that seem to float above the foliage and that genuinely do resemble small butterflies in motion when there is any breeze at all. Gora blooms from late May all the way through to frost with almost no deadheading required, making it possibly the single lowest maintenance long bloomer on this entire list. It is drought tolerant once established, thrives in poor soil, and its airy, see-through habit makes it valuable for planting toward the front or middle of a bed, where it does not block the view of plants behind it the way a denser plant would. The reason most people have never grown it is simply that it is not commonly stocked at large chain garden centres, which tend to carry the same handful of well-known perennials. It is worth seeking out from a specialty nursery or growing from seed, because once established, it is genuinely one of the easiest, longest blooming plants available. Now let me talk about how these 11 plants work together as a system, because the real value here is not any single plant, but how staggering their bloom windows creates the continuous colour effect. Coreopsis and Gora start the earliest, both beginning in May and running essentially the entire season. Salvia and Veronica coming close behind, in late May and early June, with their first flush running into early July, at which point cutting them back triggers a second flush that carries them into late summer. Echinacea, Gaillardia and Rudbeckia form the backbone of the midsummer colour from June through September, all of them extremely heat and drought tolerant, which matters because midsummer is exactly when many gardens struggle most. Agastachian phlox add height and fragrance and pollinator activity through the same midsummer window. And as all of these begin to wind down in late summer, sedum picks up the colour in its changing flower heads, while aster carries the bloom all the way to frost. The result, when these are planted together in a bed with attention to height, so the taller plants like phlox, agastache and aster are toward the back or middle, and the lower growing coreopsis and Gora are toward the front, is a bed that genuinely never has a dead period. Never has 2 or 3 weeks where everything has finished blooming and nothing new has started yet, which is the gap that most perennial beds fall into, and that makes people think they need to fill the space with annuals that have to be replanted every single year. I want to be honest about the timeline, because this is where people often get discouraged unnecessarily. A newly planted perennial bed does not look like the bed I described at the start of this video in its first year. There is an old saying among people who garden seriously that perennials sleep the first year, creep the second year, and leap the third year. And in my experience, that is a fair description of what actually happens. In the first year, most of these plants are putting their energy into establishing a root system rather than producing a large amount of top growth and flowers. And a newly planted bed will look sparse, with visible gaps of soil or mulch between young plants. This is normal, and it is not a sign that something has gone wrong. Resist the urge to crowd in extra plants to fill those gaps, because the spacing that looks too generous in year 1 is exactly the spacing these plants need by year 3, once they have matured and spread to their full size. In the second year, the plants put on noticeably more growth and begin to fill in the gaps between them, and the bed starts to look more like a cohesive planting rather than a collection of individual small plants. By the third year, most of these perennials have reached a mature size, and a bed planted with the spacing and the 11 plants described here genuinely does fill in completely and produce the kind of continuous colour from May to frost that started this entire conversation. I want to give you a practical note on maintenance, because I know one of the appeals of a perennial bed is reduced work compared to annuals, and I do not want to overstate that. These plants are genuinely lower maintenance than annuals, which need to be planted fresh every spring, watered more frequently because of their shallower root systems, and deadheaded constantly to keep blooming at all. But lower maintenance is not zero maintenance. The cutting back of salvia, veronica, and aster after their first bloom flush is not optional if you want the second flush. The occasional deadheading of coreopsis and gaillardia extends their bloom, but is not strictly required for the plant's health. And dividing these perennials every 3 to 4 years, digging up the root clump and splitting it into smaller sections to replant, keeps them vigorous and prevents the centre of older clumps from dying out, which happens naturally to most perennials as they age, if they are never divided. Let me talk about soil preparation, because this is the step most people skip or rush through, and it has more to do with how well this entire system performs over the years than any single plant choice does. Almost every plant on this list, with the exception of phlox, which prefers more consistent moisture, performs best in well-drained soil. This is worth emphasizing because it runs counter to what many people assume, which is that richer, more amended soil with more water retention is always better for a flower bed. For drought-tolerant perennials like coreopsis, gaillardia, echinacea, and gora, soil that holds too much moisture around the root crown through winter is far more likely to kill the plant than soil that is too dry through a hot summer. These plants evolved in prairie and meadow conditions with fast-draining soil, and planting them in heavy clay or in a low spot where water collects after rain is the single most common reason people tell me a perennial they planted did not come back the following spring. It was not the cold that killed it. It was wet roots sitting in poorly drained soil through the winter months. If your native soil is heavy clay, the fix is not to dig a hole and fill it with rich, amended soil, which actually creates a bowl that holds water even more than the surrounding clay does. The better approach is to raise the entire bed slightly, 4 to 6 inches above the surrounding grade, using a mix of your native soil amended generously with coarse sand and compost, so that excess water has somewhere to drain to, rather than pooling around the crowns of the plants. This is exactly how we built the bed along the south side of our house, raised slightly above the surrounding lawn, with a mix that drains freely. And it is a meaningful part of why these plants have thrived here for as long as they have, without the winter losses that are common in flower beds planted directly into unamended clay. Sun exposure matters as much as soil. Every plant on this list, except for a small amount of tolerance in a few of them, performs best with a minimum of 6 hours of direct sun daily, and several of them, particularly gaillardia, coreopsis, and echinacea, perform noticeably better with 8 or more hours. A bed that looks sunny in spring before the trees have leafed out can become significantly shadier by July once nearby trees are in full leaf. And this seasonal shift in light is something worth observing for a full year before committing to a permanent perennial bed in a new location. We learned this the hard way with an earlier attempt at a bed closer to the barn, which looked perfect in April and turned out to be shaded for half the day by August. The cost comparison to an annual bed of similar size is significant over time. A bed planted entirely with annuals requires a full replanting every single spring, with the cost of new plants running anywhere from $3 to $6 per plant, depending on size, and a bed of any meaningful size requiring dozens of plants. A perennial bed, once established, which typically takes 2 to 3 years to fill in fully, requires essentially no replanting cost going forward. Only the occasional addition of a new plant, if you want to expand the bed, or replace something that did not thrive in its specific spot. Over a 5-year period, the difference between maintaining an annual bed and maintaining an established perennial bed is commonly several $100s, sometimes more depending on the size of the space. This kind of knowledge, what actually performs over a full season rather than what looks impressive on a plant tag for 2 weeks in spring, what genuinely needs little water and little fertilizer once established versus what requires constant attention, is exactly the kind of practical garden knowledge that my wife has built up over 15 years of trial and observation in this specific bed. And it is the same kind of knowledge that is in the books, the planting calendar, the soil and garden knowledge, the methods that have worked on this property across generations, rather than what a garden centre display happens to be promoting this season. The link is in the description, or find everything on our channel. Tell me in the comments what climate zone you are gardening in, and whether you have grown any of these 11 plants before, because performance does vary somewhat by region, and I would like to hear what has worked well or poorly for people in different parts of the country. And if you have a long-blooming perennial that was not on this list, that has performed well for you, I want to know about it, because my wife is always looking to add to this bed. Next time, I'm going to show you the specific technique my wife uses to start many of these perennials from seed, rather than buying established plants, which can reduce the cost of filling a bed like this by 80 to 90%, compared to buying potted perennials from a nursery. Subscribe so you do not miss it. 11 plants. Staggered bloom windows. A flower bed that has colour from May until frost without a single annual ever planted in it. That is the whole system. And it is the same system my wife has used and refined for 15 years on this property. And it still works the same way it always has.